Good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Robert Myers. I'm currently the director of the Center for American Studies and Research here at the American University of Beirut. We're very happy to have you all here this afternoon as we inaugurate our speakers series. For those of you who've come before, you know it's one of the most intriguing, stimulating intellectual events that takes place here at the university. And we're quite honored to have as our first speaker this year, Raff Ellis, who is a writer of short stories, of essays, of political commentary. He's a very accomplished entrepreneur. He began as a computer programmer and ended up as the CEO of a company that does research and development. His educational background is that he's a graduate of LeMoyne College with a BS in pure science, and he has an MBA from the University of Central Florida. He now lives in Florida and has 5 children with his wife, Loretta. What's quite extraordinary about the book that he'll be talking about and the Lebanese experience of immigration is that it's one that's born of a very personal experience. It's born of his relationship with his father, who immigrated to the United States in 1914 from Lebanon, his mother in 1926. In addition to oral histories, tapings, he also found a collection of letters, and he did extensive research for the book here at the American University of Beirut. So we're so happy to have him back here to talk about it. I do want to mention a couple of other events, and then there's a wonderful quote I'd like to read you about his book, and we'll let Raff Ellis begin. This is part of an ongoing series of lectures. We're firming up the schedule, but we'll have 2 lectures in November. If you have not, for any reason, signed our email list here, please give us the information of how we can send you an email, and we'll do it. Of course, there are announcements also on the AUB website, but Mutawa, the well-known cartoonist, will be here in November, as well as Donald Sharps. So please do give us your. I'm sorry. Yeah, please give us your email information, how to contact you, and we're very happy to have you here. The quote that I wanted to read before Mr. Ellis begins his talk, which is entitled Lebanese Emigration, 1881 to 1914, How and Why the First Wave Emigration Occurred, is one from a very well-known American journalist. She's the dean of the White House Corps of Correspondence, Helen Thomas, and she wrote about Raff Ellis's book, which is entitled Kisses from a Distance. She says that it brought tears to my eyes. It is beautifully written, and the story of every family whose members courageously left their homes and families in the Middle East before and at the turn of the 20th century, as did my parents. In a way, it is every immigrant's story seeking a better life for their families enduring incredible hardships. Ellis traced his heritage and found individual greatness and kindness. I wish there would be less demonization of the Arab world today and more understanding of its great people. I know Ellis's book will help that bridge. So please join me in welcoming Raff Ellis here to AUB and to CASAR to inaugurate our series.
Thank you, Bob, for that wonderful introduction. I'm going to start off today with a short video about my book. It'll sort of give you a background of how I got to accumulate the information that's going to be contained in my lecture today. Where's the sound? Sound, sound, sound. No. Stereo, but I don't know how to turn this off. Okay. Trick to that, something like that. Is this on? Yes. It is.
Can you turn this mic on? You know how to turn this on?
As a result of researching and writing this book, which took me on a journey to places I didn't know I would ever go and to meet people I didn't know I'd ever meet, and to learn about things that I didn't think I'd ever learn. The journey that I went on, as Bob mentioned briefly, was that when I decided to write this book, after a long and anguished trial and error. This is what art really involves. You know, you try something and that's not quite right, so you go back and try it over. And what I did was finally decided to make the book into a journey. That I would journey into the past and I would discover how the people of my ancestors' time actually lived here in Lebanon. And I came to Lebanon several times to find the places where they walked, the houses they lived in, and to mingle with the old people in the villages, taking their oral histories and so forth, to try to find out, to try to really experience what it was like for the Lebanese in the late 1800s, early 1900s, when they were trying to get out of the country. So the first wave, by the way, do we want to douse the lights here? I think you can see the screen better if we do that. Okay. One of my favorite quotes from one of the Lebanese historians I read was that historians often differ. And yes, they do. They can't even decide when the first wave of emigration from Lebanon began or when it ended. Some think it began in 1859 and ended in 1948, and others have different dates. My date is, as I said, 1884 to 1914. That was when most of the people from Lebanon emigrated in the first wave. Now, one of the first questions I had were, who were these people anyway? The vast majority of the first wave immigrants were Christians. And they went all around the world, really. But my focus is on those that came to the States.
They were Christians of two varieties. The majority were Maronites, and the second most populous group was the Orthodox. That is not to say that there weren't some Muslims or some Druze who emigrated as well, but they were very, very small in number. I know one family of Muslims that emigrated to Iowa, Cedar Rapids, Iowa, back at that same time. They're Sunni Muslims from South Lebanon. But, as I said, the principal numbers were Maronites and Orthodox. Their occupations, the Maronites were principally farmers and laborers, and the Orthodox were mainly from the merchant or trades class. And that actually, I've not seen any studies done on this, but that actually determined their occupations in the States. As you know, many peoples from this area bear names such as the American names of carpenter or cooper or whatever. It belongs to a trade. Well, the same thing is true here, where you have Najjar and Hajar and so forth. This is a question that many people don't really know the answer to. Why did they leave Lebanon? Why were they so anxious to go? There are three principal factors in why they left. Number one was after the Peasant Revolt of 1860, 1863, the long peace ensued on Lebanon. From 1864 to 1914, 50 years, there were no wars here in Lebanon. And what happens when you don't have any wars? Well, you don't have any subtractions of people due to war. No people are being killed. And what happens then is that the population increases dramatically. The second major factor that influenced the exodus from Lebanon was the rush to sericulture. Almost every household in the mountains of Lebanon raised silkworms. It was the biggest cash crop. And the silkworms, of course, have certain properties. One is that they only eat mulberry leaves. And so the farmers in Lebanon had to raise mulberry bushes and trees. And when you do that, you can't raise other things, other foodstuffs. And this compromised the food production in the mountains, and they became net importers of food. And since there is a deficit of arable land in all of Lebanon, it's something like 16.7% of Lebanon has arable land that you can farm on, raise crops. Up in the mountains, it's even less than that. So when they decided to rush to this cash crop, silkworms, they ended up becoming net importers of food. And that requires a chain of supply that if it's interrupted for any reason, as it was in World War I, for example, the population was put on the brink of starvation. Now, one of the urban myths that you will find rampant in the States from the Lebanese descendants of the First Wave is that their grandparents came because of persecution by the Ottomans. And there is nothing in the literature that supports that idea. But yet they cling to this notion that their ancestors were pursued and persecuted by the Ottomans, and that's why they left. And no matter how often I tell people that's not true, it's hard to shake their belief in that myth. How did they leave the country? Well, it started up in the mid-1880s. And if you think about it, the war and the reglement of 1863, 1864 that set the borders of Lebanon. About 20 years after that was when the first wave really began. It's one generation. And that number intrigued me. So I began looking around at other areas. And it turns out that after a large-scale insurrection, that it takes about one generation, 20 years, for the population to recover. And then either another war happens or massive migration occurs. It's an interesting phenomenon. And so here in Lebanon, what happened was that this, one generation later, this spurred emigration because it was in line with both population growth and the increase in poverty. Because the Lebanese people in what was described as Lebanon at that time did not have a lot of opportunities. You know, they mainly were farmers and laborers, and this began the first exodus of Lebanese brains to the rest of the world, which is Lebanon's greatest export, I think. The other thing, another factor people don't understand is that when the steamship companies in the late 1800s began building bigger and bigger steamships, they wanted to encourage more and more passengers. And how did they do that? Well, it was very similar to what happened in the United States in the 1850s, thereabouts. The railroads came online about that time, and they're looking for more business, so they sent railroad agents all around the country telling them that there was fortunes to be made in the western part of the United States. And that's where you get that quote from Horace Greeley, "Go west, young man, go west." They had a similar thing happen here and in southern Europe. The steamship agents were scouring the villages and telling people, you know, fortunes to be made in the Americas, and buy the steamship ticket. Simsars also played a role. You all know what a simsar is, right? Anybody?
What's simsar?
Yeah, isn't that person that takes money if he finds you land?
He loans money. He will take, you know, a mortgage on your house, whatever, if you want to borrow money to travel. And sometimes they didn't get paid back, but they got the property instead. The other thing, others waited around for people who had left before them to send money back to the let them come. And this began what was called the chain migration effect. The first pioneers went and they struggled, they worked, they sent back money, and then this chain began. The next ones came, they sent back money and so forth. The brothers, the cousins, whoever would follow them along. Now, another interesting phenomenon that occurred at the same time was that the Ottomans saw all these Lebanese racing to get out of the country, and they became very upset about it. And they began to restrict immigration. And the harder they tried to restrict it, the more desperate the people and the more resourceful the people became. If you can say one thing about the Lebanese, they're very resourceful people. The Ottomans didn't want the immigration to give them a bad name, which it did. I mean, after all, you think about the Ottoman Empire, the area that it encompassed, you know, the Holy Land, the original Garden of Eden, and so forth. They had control of all this area, and now the West was seeing all these people wanting to get out. This wasn't a good idea for the Ottomans. Not only that, they felt that the Muslims had an obligation to stay in their homelands. That was considered bad form if they were to leave. So what happened as a result of that, in 1892, in fact, they banned emigration altogether. And this only spurred them on. They did have one legitimate beef, the Ottomans, and that was that many people who were anxious to get out didn't really have the wherewithal to support themselves once they crossed the border into, they took a ship to a French port, Marseille, or they went to Spain, Barcelona, or wherever, and many of them became destitute. Contrary to popular Lebanese opinion, which is that everybody that immigrates becomes rich, that's not quite true. And several of these people who left their farms in Lebanon found themselves without funds in Europe. And what they took to begging. And they were Christians, and they found very quickly that the best way to get sympathy from the people they were begging from was to badmouth the Ottomans. And they told these fantastic stories of being persecuted and how the Ottomans had kidnapped their children, how they, that we are poor Christians being, compromised and tyrannized by the Ottomans. And I believe that that is actually the root of the story that traveled to America and that has been passed down through the generations of Lebanese. It's not true, of course, but nonetheless, it evoked sympathy, and the Ottomans actually financed the return of some of these destitute people. They were so anxious to not get a bad name from this that they funded them to come back. However, no matter how much the Ottomans repressed emigration, Lebanese were determined to go. I mean, it was out of necessity. And as a result, there's a huge black market springing up. Between the years of 1892 and 1898, when they finally repealed the restriction on emigration, there was a Lebanese mafia that got set up around immigration. It's sort of like what happened in the States when they passed the Volstead Act in 1919, when they outlawed alcohol, the black market booze. Matter of fact, that gave root to the total organized crime activity in the United States. A similar thing happened here around immigration. There were people that were easily corrupted, people that worked at the port, people who were officials, customs officials and so forth, people that worked for the shipping lines. And so everybody with their hand out along the way for the baksheesh that comes, from each of these poor people trying to get out of the country. It became a big business. And then some finally, in desperation, stowed away on ships. Now, this is a map, of course, of Lebanon as it exists today. The borders were set in 1920. But the original borders of Lebanon were defined in 1864. And this actually, when people spoke of the Lebanon, this is what they were talking about, that area. And of course, Beirut was never part of the original Lebanon. And neither was Zahri, and of course all of the areas north and south. The reglement I spoke of gave them a Christian governor. The Christian governor had to be a Catholic. He could not be Lebanese, and he had to be an Ottoman subject. And that's why, through the course of the long peace, you had governors of Lebanon who were from Bulgaria, for example, or Poland. They were Ottoman subjects, and they were Catholic, but they were not Lebanese. Now, it's important to note that the Ottoman governor of the Lebanon, as described here, reported directly to the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. He reported directly to the Porte, on the same par with the governor of Syria. And that is why, oftentimes, when people say to me, you Lebanese are really just part of Syria, you have to understand that. Tell them, I said, you have to understand history. That regardless of what the cartographers put on the maps, there was a Lebanon in 1864 reporting on the same level that the Syrian governor reported. It also gave Lebanon its own gendarmerie. It's a paramilitary force, it's part police and part military. And these people policed the borders of the original Lebanon. So I asked people if they had their own police force made up of Lebanese men, how were the Ottomans coming in and persecuting them? It wasn't possible. As a matter of fact, the Ottoman soldiers were restricted from going into Lebanon. They could only pass through in transit from the north to the south or vice versa. But they were not permitted. I went up in the mountains and I asked the oldest people I could find, you ever see an Ottoman soldier? Never saw one. So the next thing was that in order to keep the Lebanese more docile, they gave them lower taxes. They were about half of what the citizens of Beirut had to pay and the surrounding area. And the Lebanese had a reputation of being somewhat fractious. Everybody, including the Mamluks and whoever invaded Lebanon back through the ages, always had trouble conquering the mountainous area. And so the Ottomans, in their wisdom, decided to give them some benefits to keep them quiet. And one of them was lower taxes, so much so that people who lived in Beirut, for example, tried to establish residence in the mountains in order to pay lower taxes. The other thing was that they were exempt from conscription into the Ottoman forces. Although they lived, in many cases, side by side with the Druze were not exempt. Only the Christians were exempt. So whenever I meet a Lebanese first or second generation, he tells me my grandfather came to escape going into the Ottoman army. I tell him, I hate to burst that balloon, that's not true. And they find that hard to believe. But it was true. Even in World War I, after they did away with the reglement and all of the restrictions, they didn't conscript the Christians. Okay, how did they leave Lebanon? Well, of course, they went by ship, except for those that, of course, traveled on land. The first immigrants from the mid-1800s, many went to Egypt. And, of course, they traveled by land for the most part. And there were cases where boats left Beirut and went through the Straits of Gibraltar, but they were rare. The vast majority boarded ships that only plied the Mediterranean basin. And they went from Beirut to Alexandria, and from Alexandria to Naples, and then from Naples to Marseille. And then they would cross Marseille by rail to Bordeaux or Cherbourg, or one of the deep water ports. The reason they did that, instead of taking ships all the way from here, around here, and up that way, it saved about 3 days on board ship. And 3 days on ship was expensive. So this is the route most took. Now, a lot of them became stranded in Marseille. They got stranded for visa reasons, they got stranded because of money problems and so forth. And as a result, a large Lebanese infrastructure was built up in Marseille. They had Lebanese hotel owners, and they had translators. They had young boys go down to the docks, and every time a ship docked, they would besiege the passengers and tell them, you know, come to this hotel. And they would get paid for doing that. I know one fellow who read my book, he read that in the book, he said, you know, my father used to do that. He was one of those boys who went down to the ship. Now, of course, you all know that Lebanese not only went to America, you know, they went to Australia, they went to Africa, and various other places that they could get to. And there's hardly a city you can go to around the world where you can't find Lebanese. I mean, they're all over. But my talk is concerned with the Lebanese that came to America. They docked at Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and even New Orleans. But the vast majority went through Ellis Island. Now, many people who are descendants of Lebanese in the States don't know their history. A lot of it has been lost. They never, people write to me and say, you know, I wish I would have asked my parents questions, you know, I never asked them. And so many of them have the wrong idea of what happened. Ellis Island only started in 1892 and ran for 5 years. So people who came before that from Lebanon and after 1897 until 1902 did not go through Ellis Island. Yet many of their descendants believe they went through Ellis Island. And Ellis Island ran a big campaign for people to inscribe their ancestors' names on the Wall of Honor for a fee. And many of the Lebanese who came prior and in that period when Ellis Island wasn't working, of course, inscribed their ancestors' names, and even though they didn't go through Ellis Island. In 1902, after it burned down in 1897, they began receiving immigrants at an old barge canal in Battery Park, New York. And the conditions became so reprehensible there that the newspapers took up the cause, and Teddy Roosevelt, who was president at the time, insisted that Ellis Island be reconstructed, and it reopened in 1902. In 1907, there were 12,000 people processed in one day. It's hard to imagine that many people going through immigration. But they passed them through rather fast. And in 1919, 500,000 immigrants processed through Ellis Island. This is what the Great Hall at Ellis Island looked like back in 1912. This was just a couple of years before my dad came through there. You can see the horde of people waiting to be processed. And I devote a whole chapter in my book to the Ellis Island experience, telling what I visited there, and I tried to feel what it was like for these people to come through here, not knowing the language and having their luggage piled up and waiting in line, and rumors going through the crowd telling that people were being rejected for this or that or the other reason. Yet only about 1 or 2% were actually rejected. A doctor would take all of 6 seconds to medically approve an immigrant. We would look them up and down, mainly look in the eyes, looking for a common eye disease that they had at the time. And then, of course, they would write in chalk on the back of their shirt or their jacket, this person had to go to quarantine, or this person had to be rejected for one reason or other. And other things that happened were that the immigration laws were changing all the time. I mean, from year to year they changed. And of course, the poor immigrant was being told things that he didn't understand, or rumors flew around, that you had to have $50. That was actually a rule at one time. You had to have $50 in your pocket. Otherwise, you couldn't be admitted, because they didn't want people to become beggars, to become destitute in the States. They didn't want people who couldn't work, because that wouldn't be good for an expanding United States. So they were resourceful, the Lebanese were. A guy would walk up, show us $50, and the doctor would look him over in 6 seconds, paid, said, okay, you're fine. He'd pass the $50 back to the next guy in line, and he would walk up and pass. So the same money was used many times to pass the immigration rule at that time. Another thing that I call an urban myth, I don't know if you've probably all heard this, that their family names were changed at Ellis Island. Anybody heard that before? I talked to people today, they told me, oh yeah, my family name was changed at Ellis Island. And I tell them, can you prove that? I mean, do you have a document from Ellis Island that shows that the name was changed? Well, no, but I know that the name was changed, and I say, well, I have to break it to you. The names were not changed at Ellis Island. What happened with the names was that when a person got on the ship, the bursar of the ship would write down their name. Now, oftentimes, the bursar got it wrong, and oftentimes he was transliterating from Arabic to English. And when you do that, you realize, of course, that you can spell the same name a dozen different ways, phonetically. And the Ellis Island people worked from the ship manifest. And if you look at a ship manifest, you will see that they put a little check mark next to the name. The people on ships were grouped by nationality. And, it was sort of discriminatory. They would say all the Lebanese were in the same hole. All the Italians were in the same place. So if you go through a ship manifest, you will find that all these various nationalities are grouped together, and they were processed that way through Ellis Island. In fact, Ellis Island hired several translators, different languages. I know I asked my dad this question. I said, when you got up to the counter, he said they had a translator for us. And I talked to him and answered all the questions through the translator. So this notion that the Ellis Island people were willy-nilly changing names is just totally false. There are no documents that I've been able to find that say Ellis Island on them. They came in with their passports and visas, they left with the same document. Okay? Ellis Island people didn't change anything. So if somebody tells you that, tell them you heard it from the horse's mouth, that's not true. One of the things that I found fascinating was that if you go over the ship manifest, one of the things that you have to put down, the immigrants had to put down, is their ultimate destination in the States, and who the person was that they were coming to visit or see or to live with or whatever. And in 1900, you could not believe how dispersed the Lebanese had become in the United States. I would look at it and a guy would say, I am coming to my brother in Waco, Texas, 1900. How did they get from the 1885, all these people became peddlers, and they just peddled and peddled until they got enough money together, they could open a little store, and they stopped there, and that became their residence. One of the destinations was Carthage, New York. This was my hometown. And I was very interested to know why all these Lebanese congregated in Carthage, New York. It was all because of this one man. Abdul Kamai, who took the name Maroon, which was his grandfather's given name, back for his brother, who came 4 years later, and they sent back for cousins, and they sent back for other relatives and so forth, who all came and all said they were coming to visit Abdul Maroon in Carthage, New York. A colony of people gathered as a result of Abdul Maroon's efforts in Carthage, New York. At one point, there were 30 families or individuals who lived in Carthage, New York. It's a small town, about 4,000 people. And to have that large a concentration of Lebanese in one place is unusual. And they all came from one place, Batuta, Kesarwan. Anybody know where Batuta is? You can see it's a famous place. And they all had different names, such as the names I've gotten. And many of them were not the real family name, of course. Many of them, as became somewhat of a de rigueur for the Lebanese, was to choose the grandfather's first name. And I researched that. Why did they do that? Well, there were a couple of reasons. One of which was that when people come from the same village, the same family name is propagated, throughout the village. And so if you go up into the small villages, they never call the people by their family name. When I went up to Batuta the first time, and I was identified as Ibn Tufik, my father was always known as Tufik Trad, his father's name. They never said his name without naming his father after him. And they never said Khmai, which was his family name. And I asked my dad about that, and he said, too many Khmais, too many. And this is how we differentiate ourselves from one another. And I said, are you all related? He'd say, not too close. Over dozens of years and generations, the family spread apart, but the name stayed the same. So that was one of the reasons. The other reason was they wanted to anglicize their name. If nothing else, the Lebanese are very adaptive. They adapt to the culture they're immersed in. Many of them took anglicized names, and some of them got the names whether they liked it or not. I had an uncle, his name was Sejan. Anybody know what Sejan means? I had a hard time finding out what Sejan means, an ancient name. It means to coo like a pigeon, He was a pigeon talker. But the people up there, he was in business, a peddler, so they called him Tommy. So he became Tommy, okay. And nearly all of these people went into business, That I found to be a fascinating aspect. When you think of it, all of these people were farmers and laborers, and yet they all wanted to go into business. At one time, in my little town of Carthage, New York, there were 10 Lebanese corner grocery stores. Some not even a block apart. 10 in a town of 4,000 people. They also had, of course, a liquor store, meat market, dry goods, restaurant, bar and grill, etc. This is an interesting photograph. It was taken in 1910. And this man over here with the field glasses is Abdul Kamai. This picture was taken on the occasion of Abdul coming back to Lebanon to fetch a bride, to bring back to Carthage, New York. I tell people he's looking through the field glasses, you know, he's looking east actually, and he's sort of like Sarah Palin, she could see Russia from her backyard. Well, he could see Lebanon from Carthage, New York, you know. Anyway, they all gathered for this photograph in front of the closing out sale. I found it interesting. So all of the people that came after Abdul Kamai put down his address, 57 State Street. I went through numerous ship manifests. I tried to trace all of these Lebanese families who came to Carthage, and every one that I could find put down, I'm coming to visit Abdul Kamai, 57 State Street, Carthage, New York. Every one. Interesting. Now, a problem that you know, when you think about it, the immigrants, who'd they send? They sent the young men to go and earn money to send back. Remittances became such a large part of the Lebanese GDP, even to this day. It's estimated to be 50% of the GDP, remittances. And back then, who was best equipped to go and send back money? The young men. They were as young as 11 that I found. And most of them were around 16 or 17. But there again, another problem arose for these young men. There was a restriction, age restriction on, that also varied like a money restriction for immigrants, you know. A boy traveling by himself had to be 19 years old or he wouldn't be accepted. I found numerous times, this is another thing, you know, I was trained as a mathematician, so numbers jump out at me. I kept going down these manifests, every one of these guys was 20 years old, and I couldn't understand why. And it was because they learned very early on that they better boost their age. My dad was 16, but on his ship manifest says he was 20, you know. And many, many of the other ones, the younger men, were all 20 years old. So when they established themselves in the States, got a little money, and got up in their 20s and going on 30, they began thinking of raising a family. So what did they do? They had to go back to Lebanon to find a bride. They came back dressed to the nines, you know, silk suits and celluloid collars and the whole business, you know. I said to my mother, I said, why, you know, why did you ever hook up with my father? Well, she said, you know, he returned and he labis helu. That's an old term. I've tried it out on people. They say, what does this mean, labis helu? I said, well, he dressed up like a sheikh, you know. I mean, he was a dapper guy. I mean, I'll show you a picture here in a minute. Nice looking guy, but he was a peasant, you know. But the peasant girls were no longer as attractive to these young businessmen coming back from the States. This is a picture of my dad on his wedding day, and that's my mom. I know you're not supposed to smile in the picture, Mom, but what happened here? She looks, I think she overdid it, you know. So Dad was a pretty dapper guy, and he got an arrangement with a family that were well above his class, his peasant class, you know. He found a sheikh, you know, and he ruled that day ever since, I think. Another man who went with my dad was also single, when he got up to Batuta, they were all saying to him, you know, what about this girl, this gal? And he said, no, 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 no. He said, I have to have a woman who knows how to walk on sidewalks. I couldn't help but begin to draw conclusions about the Lebanese, ever since I was a kid, actually. In my dad's store, the Lebanese men of the village would always come in and they would be talking about Lebanon, about this, that, and the other thing. I was listening, absorbing all this information about how beautiful the mountains were and about this, that, and the other thing. It's something that I noticed that other ethnics in the States did not seem to possess, this tremendous attraction to their home country. My wife is Italian, for example. She has no connection to Italy. And yet, you know, here I am, a kid who grew up Lebanese, who didn't want to be Lebanese because it wasn't chic, you know, to be Lebanese when I was a kid. We wanted to be Americans, you know. We believed that old story about the melting pot and that they taught us in school, you know. They throw in all of these different elements and you come out with one alloy called American, you know. It doesn't work that way. It never did. And when you began to reflect on the prejudice that we felt, in my hometown there were no black people. Okay? So we became the niggers. And I was called that many times. I was either black Syrian or nigger. You know? And that stuck in my mind, especially when I was doing this research. The characteristics I observed of the Lebanese people, and I think it's still true today, they don't trust the government. Even though they came to the States, they were very distrustful of the government they saw and were ruled by. They tend to be overly suspicious, I think. You can't, at least of the generation that emigrated, you couldn't tell them something and they would accept it at face value. You know, you sort of had it, they were doubting Thomases all along the line. I would tell my dad something I had just discovered, and he'd say, yeah, sure, yeah. And I knew that he didn't believe it, you know. One time I was, just to show you a glimpse of what that mentality was like. One time I wanted to go to movies on Saturday afternoon. I needed a dime, okay? So the kids who were going to the movies stopped with me by the store and ran in and said, Pop, I need a dime to go to the movies. The movies? Who with? He said, my friends. Your friends? He pulled out a wad of money in his pocket, peeled off a dollar bill. He said, whose picture is here? I said, Pop, everybody knows that's George Washington. He said, he's your friend. Never forgot that. I was about 10 years old. So they, you know, going shopping with a Lebanese man of that era was an experience, you know, embarrassing sometimes, you know, because paying list price for something is, you know, is a sin. You know, of course, I realized that when I came here and started shopping and haggling with these poor peddlers on the roadsides, you know. And of course, most were very frugal. I mean, really frugal. My dad saved string, you know. The newspapers he sold in his store came tied up in a rope. He would save the rope. And when they came with wire, he saved the wire, you know. Okay, the next thing was I studied the occupations of these people, and I thought this was something worthy of its own study, which is why were these farmers and laborers so anxious to go into business for themselves? You know, I mean, it was, I think it was a result of the tribal mentality that they had and their desire for independence. Because even here in Lebanon, when a minor amount of industrialization occurred in the mountains related to the silk industry, when they decided to open factories, instead of just sending the raw silk from the mountains out to France or to wherever, they set up factories to reel the silk up. The men would not work in those factories. They sent their women to work there. And this had some consequences for the society at large. Actually, it promoted independence for women in the sense that the women, once they had money, of course the men expected them to bring it home and just pass it back to the family. And some of them began to rebel against that and started keeping some of the money and began to show some independence that was an undesired consequence of them being sent to work in the factories. So these people, I think, prized their independence. And working for wages was not a desirable thing. And we saw that in their progeny, you know, in that the sons of the Lebanese immigrants gravitated towards professions, individual professions, such as doctors and lawyers, especially among the Lebanese. And, I think that you go to a big city and you throw a stone, you'll either hit a Lebanese doctor or a lawyer. You know? It's not that they, and I'm talking here in terms of numbers, not, you know, not that everybody did it, but it all has to do with, I believe, with this drive to be independent. The Lebanese that I know, and I know a lot of them, they're not good at the group dynamic. I belong to Lebanese organizations, and you get in a room with people. I, of course, had a different background. I went to work out of college for a large firm, and I had to be immersed in group decisions and so forth. And I had to manage people and get work done through people and not do it myself and so forth. But the Lebanese in general, I feel, are just not good at that. And you get them all in a room and they start arguing with one another, or you say, this is so, they say, that's not so, I'll tell you what's so, and you know, four guys have five opinions. And this is something that I believe is a part of the Lebanese ethos. In summary, on the surface, the Lebanese immigrant experience is not a lot different from the Italian experience or the Polish experience or the Spanish experience. I have people who have read my book from various nationalities. They write me, tell me, you know, you can change the names. It would be the same story. And I find that heartening that that is true, because one of the objectives I had in writing the book was to propagate the Lebanese experience, the culture, the heritage that they embrace. And if I can give that to a large segment of the American public, I will have accomplished my goal. As I mentioned over and over again, it wasn't persecution, it was poverty. The Maronite immigration was enhanced essentially by their experience with the French. You know, the French had been in Lebanon in one phase or another since the early 1700s, setting up schools, forming economic partnerships with people and so forth. And they favored the Christians, much to the chagrin of the other sects. You know, the Jews were very upset about this. And so those that left to other countries benefited from that experience. They were a bit more westernized, and that facilitated their emigration experience. The Lebanese do, even though the emigration experience is similar, they do have some unique characteristics. You know, one of them, I think, is their resourcefulness. I'm always amazed as I travel around the United States when I meet other Lebanese, and they want to tell me their story, you know, because they may have read my book or heard about it, and they want to tell me their story. And I'm just just totally amazed at the resourcefulness of these people and their adaptability. You know, I think if there are two unique characteristics you can pick out about the Lebanese, that would be it. And it's my belief that it's because of their long history of being occupied by other powers. I mean, from earliest time on, Lebanon has been a desirable piece of real estate. And people have come here and the Lebanese people have adapted to that and survived that. And that takes some doing. So I'm going to end right there. I've already shown you the video, so that's done. And I'll take questions. You have to speak up now, so I can understand the question.
Perhaps what we can do, if you don't mind, since this mic is on, I'll let you respond here, and then we'll pass.
Okay,
the mic
great.
around. Thank you. Marvelous. I learned more about Lebanese immigration here this afternoon than I had known about in 30 years of relations with the Lebanese. May I ask you a question? As we were talking about before, I grew up in Atlanta, and my best friend growing up in Atlanta was Lebanese, and her father owned a liquor store in downtown Atlanta. So I was really intrigued by your comments about having grown up in Carthage and racial self-identification, because one of the things that intrigued me about this family, and particularly her father, is this was in the pre-1964 civil rights period, or actually during the 60s, the fluidity between black and white communities. And I'm not sure that that's something that one sees, for example, in the Italian-American community or in other communities. In fact, Noel, who's not here, Ignatia, wrote a quite marvelous book called How the Irish Became White. And this whole idea of seeing oneself through a racial prism that's imposed upon immigrants in the States. I wonder if you could elaborate either personally or whatever, and then we'll let Mona pass the mic and ask some other questions.
Well, you really got to read the book, because the afterword, which is really the last chapter of the book, I discuss this issue. I had several people have told me they enjoyed, the thing they enjoyed most about the book was the last chapter, and I was staggered by that, because I said, what the heck did I say in the last chapter that would intrigue them? I had a Muslim friend, now a friend. His name is Mohammed Hussein. He's from the south of Lebanon. He's an engineer in Orlando, Florida, bought my book recently, and he sent me 2 emails telling me how much he enjoyed reading my book. And I never thought of his grouping as a target market for my book. It just never occurred to me. And he said to me, I love the last chapter best. And I said, why? And he said, you bared your soul. And I said, really? I hadn't realized I'd done that. But it touches on all of those issues that you asked about, Bob. That it took me a long time. As I said, I may have said, sometimes I talk so much I can't remember what I said, but when I was a young kid growing up in this small town, the Lebanese kids were not my friends. There were very few in my age group, but my friends were all American, you know. And I wanted to be, I was a basketball player, you know, and I loved chumming around with those kids, and I never thought of myself as Lebanese. I didn't really want to be Lebanese. And it wasn't until later in life, When I went in the Army during the Korean War, I found a strange thing occurred. When I got my first pass and went into New York City, what was the first thing I did? I looked for a Lebanese restaurant, Middle Eastern restaurant, whatever, you know, and I rushed up the stairs of a place called the Damascus Gardens on 32nd Street in New York City. And I inhaled the odors, you know, of the arish and whatever, you know. And I asked myself that question. I said, well, why did I do that? And I found that the harder I tried to leave my ethnicity, the harder it pushed back at me. And I discuss some of these personal issues in my book. I don't know, you know, how to answer that other than what I've said, Bob.
It's quite an answer. Maybe, I'm sure we must have another question here. Here was a question here in the back.
You say there was poverty, abject poverty here in Lebanon. Is this because of bad government? Why was there this?
The poverty was caused in the period that I discussed, you know, from the mid-1880s to the onset of World War I. The poverty was caused by overpopulation, by the food chain being stressed because of the rush to sericulture. And all of these events caused the poverty. There just wasn't.
Not bad government.
Pardon?
Not bad government.
No. No, I mean, the government had really low involvement in the lives of these people. I mean, the taxes were minimal. There were no other government regulations. The only thing that the people would fear would be having to go into the army or things like that, which they didn't have to worry about. The problem was just not enough food to go around. And as I said earlier, what happens in populations or civilizations when that occurs, you either get mass migration or you get war. You know, what is politics after all? Politics is all about the allocation of resources, you know, the distribution of resources. And food and shelter, the primary resources of any population. When they don't have enough to go around, you know, they have to go out. The whole World War I experience, which I talk about in my book, which I haven't covered here, is also a sad and very interesting story that you might want to read up on. It was a horrible, horrible experience. My mother lived through World War I here in Lebanon. My father was already out. As a matter of fact, my dad, the World War I started when my dad was on the ocean. And he was the last Lebanese immigrant to come to my hometown, because after that, what happened was the ship he was on actually was turned around and sent back to be outfitted as a troop ship for the British. And it ran aground off Ireland and sank. And he was one of the last passengers that ever traveled on that boat. But then, of course, immigration stopped because the great powers put an embargo along the coast of Lebanon. No ships could get in or get out. And a lot of people think it was the Turks, the Ottomans, that did that. No, it was France and Great Britain that strung up that embargo. The Ottomans, for their part, cut off all communications to the outside world. I'm getting a little far afield here. Is this okay?
No, it's fascinating. In fact, my wife's grandfather left during this period, and there's a story story of this famine in World War I that her family faced.
So what happened, this is sort of a sequel to what I was talking about. What happened then, the Ottomans cut off communications, and the people, especially in the mountains, were dependent upon remittances, and then the remittances were cut off. Now that just stressed the situation even more. But what happened, there was a heroic group here in Beirut associated with this university called the American Press, the American Missionary Press. Does anybody know about them? Well, this is another fascinating story. The Missionary Press took it upon themselves to run advertisements in U.S. newspapers to tell people if they wanted to send money back to Lebanon, they would be the conduit. And since the Americans never went to war with the Ottomans during World War I, something that a lot of people don't understand either, because Robert University in Turkey, the president was a guy named Cleveland Dodge, and he went to visit. He was a friend of President Wilson's. He went to Wilson and he implored him not to declare war on the Ottomans, because he said all of these Americans here at American University and the missions that they had all up and down Lebanon would be persecuted by the Ottomans. And so Wilson never declared war against the Ottomans during World War I, even though he was part of the Allied effort and every other member of the Allied declared war. So the Missionary Press ran these ads, and people would bundle up the money, sometimes rolled up in a rubber band, and they'd send it with a little note, this is for so-and-so in such and such a town, up in Kesrouan or wherever. And these missionary folks would go and find those people and give them the money. And what happened then was that a lot of people heard about this, and those people had already died. And so what they would do is they'd go to the people from the missionary press, the American press, and say, I am so-and-so. And so the personnel of the press began to do research, and they would prosecute the people who were giving false information. I mean, they did a heroic job. I tell that story in the book as well. And this all started because, the missionary press, its sole purpose, it was attached to AUB, its sole purpose was to translate English religious tracts into Arabic. And they had a variety of people. They had Muslims, they had Jews, they had Christians who were doing this work. So I give them a big hand for what they did.
I'm sure we have a couple of, we have a question here.
Thanks. One of the things I thought was really interesting when you were talking is when you were giving, clearly you have a lot of anecdotal evidence. Clearly, looking through ship manifestos and looking through. One thing that I was curious about is you mentioned that there were a lot of people who ended up stranded in different places. And being stranded is not a pretty story, right? And having to beg and having to do that is not really something that a family might be proud of about their, of their own family history. And I was wondering how do you get that kind of information out of people? Because oral narratives and people, particularly immigrant narratives, can all be, as you said, many times, can be whitewashed. So where do you find that information?
Well, I was.
Is it actually from people?
I didn't tell you that the genesis of my journey to write this book was a result of my mother dying and we going through her personal effects. We found her sandu full of letters that she had saved over a 65-year span, and they describe much of this. There are letters from Marseille to my father, from Marseille to her people in Lebanon. And it was a very stressful situation for everybody concerned. And I quote from those letters in the book to give you an idea of what the people were feeling. And my mother told stories about, you know, they had people, Lebanese from Africa, from various places congregated there waiting to get visas. And of course, in 1926, it was much more difficult to get a visa than it was in 1914, before the war started. What happened in the United States, just as an aside, I'm sorry, but I have a lot of asides. In 1919, there was a great deal of xenophobia in the United States after World War I. What happened was the returning veterans from World War I found themselves unemployed. And there was a great deal of turmoil blaming immigrants for their not having jobs. And so they pressured Congress essentially to pass stiffer immigration laws, which they did over a period of several years. And they put in the quota system, for example, and the quota for Lebanon was minuscule. They used the 1900 census, and they said 3% of the 1900 census were the number they would allow in, which is a minuscule number. But being stranded, so it depends on what period, but being stranded post-World War II was common because the visas were difficult to get. There were also other pressures. You just have to live this story. You know, there are charlatans and crooks that take advantage of poor people all the time. And there were rules about women. Single women could not travel by themselves back in that time. It had to be with a family member. And the reason for that was there was a big market in white slavery. You know, people would say, this is my daughter or this is my wife and whatever, and bring her into a place in order to make money on her body, essentially, you know. And so the immigration people became attuned to that. As soon as somebody came up with a scam, they kept trying to stop it. So single women took to lying about. My aunt came, and she put down on the, she came a year before my father did, she put down on the manifest that she was married, and she wasn't. And at least we don't think she was. So getting stranded was common. My mother ended up being matron of honor or godmother to children that were born while the people were waiting to get a visa. You know, it was just the simple answer to your question is that many of the stories are lost to the tides of time, you know, and many of the descendants of the immigrants don't know their own history, nor do they have a way of getting it. I was lucky in that we had all these letters. My father and mother both saved all the documents having to do with their emigration. And my dad, we had his passport, his visa. You know that in order to emigrate, you had to have a letter from the Mukhtar or the Sheikh or whatever attesting to your good character. They didn't want criminals leaving the country. And of course, the criminals went to the black market and got out. And when my father got, and his bride got to Marseille, she couldn't get a visa. And so after a month of trying, he decided to go back home and get the visa at home. Well, one of the first things he did was he went to the village Mukhtar in Carthage, New York, and he got a letter of recommendation attesting to his good character. And we have that letter, you know. And it's funny because he thought that that actually would swing some weight with it, but it didn't, you know. So we had all these documents, and I did all this research, which took a long time. You know, I went up in the village, I talked to the oldest men I could find, 90-year-old men, and I had a tape recorder and an interpreter, and they told me their stories of what happened back then, you know, and I took it all down, and I coalesced all this information into what turned out to be the book. Yes, microphone back there.
Yeah, let's take one more question here, please.
You know, Doctor, generally speaking, why haven't the diaspora, the successful business authors, doctors, lawyers, whoever they may be, why haven't they come back to Lebanon? You know, just generally speaking, some have, but why haven't they come back to contribute back here?
I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One is this is not the land of opportunity. You know, I mean, why do all the young people leave Lebanon? It's for lack of opportunity, isn't it? I mean, I talked to president of a college here, and I said to him, I think it's a shame, you know, all these young brains leave Lebanon. He said, it's our best export. Rather concerned about exporting technology to the third world. And my focus was on Lebanon. And I came here during the 70s. And I talked to people, and I just couldn't get anybody interested in the subject. You know, I said, why, for example, more recently, I talked to a big businessman here in Lebanon, and I said to him, you know, you should have technology city here in Lebanon and have your best brains. You know, the internet is a big and growing industry, you know. That's one of the biggest industries in Israel, by the way, the internet. I said, why shouldn't this be in Lebanon, you know? There's no good answer to that, other than that there's no government stimulus for that, or there's no interest. You know, it's a land of sub-optimization. What do I mean by that? I mean that I worked for a company one time where every department, you know, was worried about its own goals. They never talked to each other. Each one was sub-optimizing his piece of the pie. But when you put it all together, the company lost money. So the whole idea of each person guarding his own turf, essentially, ends up, it redounds to the disfavor of the entire mass. And that's what I think. The reason that these doctors and lawyers, what would they do? How many can you handle? You know? Suffice it to say, they send their money back. You know? That's the best we can offer you.